from Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
We're now approaching George Bush's historic Annapolis Conference, as it's called, on Israel-Palestine, so we can anticipate a flood of deceit and distortions to set the proper framework. And we should be prepared. We should be prepared to counter the propaganda assault, which has already begun.
As representatives of over 40 countries gather in Annapolis, Maryland for a Middle East conference, we'll bring you two luminaries talking about the Israel-Palestine conflict: world-renowned linguist and author Noam Chomsky and Nobel Peace Laureate, former South African Archbishop Desmond Tutu.
If you reject your calling, you may survive for a long time, but you will find it is all corrosive inside. And one day, you will implode.
Today, Archbishop Desmond Tutu and Noam Chomsky for the hour. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Leaders from around the world are gathering in Annapolis, Maryland today for a U.S.-sponsored summit on the Middle East. President Bush met separately with Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Olmert and Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas at the White House on Monday.
Thank you for working hard to implement a vision for a Palestinian state. We want to help you. We want there to be peace. We want the people in the Palestinian territories to have hope. And we thank you for your willingness to sit down with Israel to negotiate the settlement.
More than 40 organizations and countries, including Saudi Arabia and Syria, are attending. The Israeli newspaper Haaretz reports President Bush is expected to make no new or substantive proposals on the core issues at hand. In a speech today, Bush is expected to reaffirm his recognition of Israeli claims to major settlement blocks in the Palestinian West Bank. He's also expected to restate his position that Palestinian refugees who lost their homes in 1948 should only be allowed to resettle in a future Palestinian state. Iran and Hamas have been excluded from the meeting. On Monday, dismissed Palestinian Prime Minister Ismail Haniyeh of Hamas denounced the talks as a sham.
The lawmakers of the Palestinian people today sign a document which stresses the commitment of the Palestinian people to their full rights and their commitment to the full rights of the nation on the Palestinian land and their rejection to any secessions that harm these rights.
At least 4 people were killed in Israel airstrikes in Gaza earlier today, including one civilian near a border crossing. The Bush administration has signed a new agreement with Iraq that could cement a long-term U.S. occupation. The new Declaration of Principles will steer future talks on U.S.-Iraqi ties. Officials plan to extend the UN mandate authorizing the U.S.-led occupation for another year. A long-term bilateral agreement on U.S. troop levels would follow. Iraqi officials told the Associated Press they foresee an enduring presence of around 50,000 U.S. troops. Under the proposed plan, U.S. forces would operate in permanent bases outside Iraqi cities. The Bush administration is no longer distancing itself from talk of a permanent occupation of Iraq. Deputy National Security Advisor Lieutenant General Douglas Lute said, quote, "The size and shape of any long-term presence in Iraq will be a key matter for negotiation between Iraq and the United States." Monday's agreement also calls for escalating U.S. influence in Iraq's economy. It calls, quote, for facilitating and encouraging the flow of foreign investments to Iraq, especially American investments, to contribute to reconstruction and rebuilding. Meanwhile, in Iraq, up to 4 Iraqi civilians have been killed in a U.S. military shooting in Baghdad. The victims were all bank employees riding in a minibus to work. Another 5 people were wounded. Iraq's Interior Ministry is being linked to the killing of 11 relatives of a prominent Iraqi journalist and critic of the Iraqi government. Colleagues say masked gunmen stormed the family home of Dia al-Khawaz, killing his sisters, their husbands, and children as they ate breakfast. Al-Khawaz is editor of the Asawat al-Iraq news agency. He was in Jordan at the time of the alleged murders. Reporters Without Borders says Iraqi police failed to intervene to stop the shooting. Friends say al-Khawaz has received several threats for his criticism of the U.S. occupation and Iraq's sectarian strife. On Monday, he called the attack, quote, a message to me and to any journalist inside Iraq or outside Iraq who opposes the policies of the Iraqi government. U.S. tensions with Russia are on the rise over accusations of vote meddling. On Monday, Russian President Vladimir Putin accused the Bush administration of trying to taint parliamentary elections set for next week. Putin says the U.S. influenced European monitors to cancel plans to observe the vote.
We have information that, once again, this was done on the recommendation of the U.S. State Department. We, of course, will take this into account in our interstate dealings, this is for sure. Actions such as these cannot wreck the elections in Russia. Their aim is to deprive the elections of legitimacy. That is absolutely clear. But they are not going to achieve that.
The U.S. State Department has denied Putin's charges. Putin's comments follow a weekend of protests of his government in several Russian cities. Hundreds of people were arrested. In France, unrest has again erupted in several Paris suburbs between youths and police. Hundreds of police officers fired tear gas and rubber bullets at crowds of teenagers on Monday. French officials say more than 70 officers and an unknown number of young people have been left injured. The demonstrators took to the streets after 2 young North African immigrants died in a police crash. The officers are under investigation for involuntary manslaughter amidst allegations they failed to seek medical help for the young victims. The clashes come 2 years after a 3-week youth uprising prompted by the deaths of 2 teens electrocuted as they hid from police. On Capitol Hill, Republican Senator Trent Lott of Mississippi has announced he will step down next month. Lott says he plans to pursue a career in the private sector. His year-end resignation means he'll avoid an incoming law forcing senators wanting to become paid Capitol Hill lobbyists to wait 2 years instead of 1. Lott has resisted pressure to leave office since December 2002, when he praised the 1948 pro-segregation presidential campaign of Senator Strom Thurmond.
I want to say this about my state. When Strom Thurmond ran for president, we voted for him. We're proud of it. And if the rest of the country had followed our lead, we wouldn't have had all these problems over all these years either.
Senator Lott was speaking at Thurmond's 100th birthday party. And former Vice President Al Gore was back at the White House Monday for a ceremony honoring this year's Nobel Prize winners. Gore shared the Nobel Peace Prize with the UN's Intergovernmental Campaign on Climate Change for his work on global warming. Gore met with President Bush for over half an hour before the ceremony. It was their first private meeting since December 2000, when Bush was declared the winner in their presidential race, despite losing the popular vote. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Leaders from around the world are gathering in Annapolis, Maryland today to take part in a U.S.-sponsored summit on the Middle East. President Bush met separately with Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Olmert and Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas at the White House Monday. More than 40 organizations and countries, including Saudi Arabia and Syria, are attending the conference today. Hamas was not invited. A final agenda has not yet been drawn up, but a draft of a joint document was leaked to the Israeli newspaper Haaretz. It makes no mention of the situation in Gaza or of core issues like the status of Jerusalem, settlements, borders, the separation wall, and Palestinian refugees. Today, we spend the hour on the Israel-Palestine conflict with 2 of the world's leading thinkers, former South African Archbishop Desmond Tutu and world-renowned linguist and author Noam Chomsky. They recently spoke at a conference in Boston, sponsored by Sabeel, a Palestinian Christian organization. The conference was called the Apartheid Paradigm in Palestine-Israel, highlighting issues of justice and equality. We begin today with Noam Chomsky, professor of linguistics at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology for over half a century. Chomsky is the author of dozens of books on U.S. foreign policy. His most recent is called Failed States: The Abuse of Power and the Assault on Democracy. Noam Chomsky spoke before a packed audience at Boston's historic Old South Church.
Personal discomfort, because anything I say will be abstract and dry and restrained. The crimes against Palestinians in the occupied territories and elsewhere, particularly Lebanon, are so shocking that the only emotionally valid reaction is rage and call for extreme actions. But that does not help the victims. And in fact, it's likely to harm them. We have to face the reality that our actions have consequences, and they have to be adapted to real-world circumstances, difficult as it may be to stay calm in the face of shameful crimes in which we are directly and crucially implicated. Well, I've been asked to talk about the apartheid paradigm and the proper response here, so I'll do that, though not without some additional reservations. We have to recognize that there will be no clear answer as to the question of whether the apartheid paradigm applies in Israel or in Boston, right here, or elsewhere. The genre has, after all, only one example, South Africa. And there are similarities elsewhere in many dimensions, and it's fair enough to bring them up, but there's very little point debating whether they are close enough in one or another case to count as apartheid, because that will never be settled. We know that in advance. I've brought up similarities in the past when I thought that they were appropriate. Actually, the one time I recall clearly was exactly 10 years ago. That was at a conference at Ben Gurion University in Beersheba. It was on the anniversary of the 30th year of the military occupation. And in the talk there, I quoted from a standard history of South Africa on elections in the Bantustans, which I'll read and just change a few words and you'll know what it's about. South African retention of effective power through its officials in the Bantustans, its overwhelming economic influence and security arrangements gave to this initiative of elections elements of a farce. However, unlikely candidates as were the Bantustans for any meaningful independent existence, their expanding bureaucracies provided jobs for new strata of educated Africans tied to the system in a new way, and a basis for accumulation for a small number of Africans with access to loans and political influence. Repression, too, could be indigenized through developing homeland policy and army personnel. On the fringe of the Bantustans, border industry growth centers were planned as a means of freeing capital from some of the restraints imposed on industrial expansion elsewhere, and to take advantage of virtually captive and particularly cheap labor. Within the homelands, economic development was more a matter of advertising brochures than actual practical activity, though some officials in South Africa understood the needs from their own perspective for some kind of revitalization of the homelands to prevent their economies from collapsing even further. Well, I won't waste time expressing the similarities to the occupied territories, but you can do that quite easily. 10 years ago, that was the optimistic prospect for the occupied territories. By now, even that's remote, and reality is far more grim than it was then. There's no time, and I presume no need, to review the harrowing details. We're now approaching George Bush's historic Annapolis Conference, as it's called, on Israel-Palestine, so we can anticipate a flood of deceit